On September 4, 2025, two Venezuelan F-16s armed with missiles dove toward a U.S. Navy destroyer, coming so close that one wrong move could have started a war. For 3 terrifying seconds, their targeting radar locked onto the ship's hull. No shots were fired, but that morning pushed both nations to the edge of a catastrophe. This is the story of how a single flyover nearly ignited a conflict in the Caribbean. September 4, 2025. The morning sun hadn't yet broken the horizon, but aboard the USS Jason Dunham, every radar screen was already alive with light. 2 fast-moving contacts had just appeared from the south, low, fast, and on a direct line toward the destroyer. The officer of the deck lifted his binoculars toward the dim outline of the Venezuelan coastline. Nothing visible yet, only the faint approach of dawn and the restless churn of the Caribbean. But the radar was saying something else entirely. Those contacts weren't slowing down. They weren't turning. They were coming straight for his ship. In under 4 minutes, 2 Venezuelan F-16s would rip across the Dunham's bow at 400 knots. And what happened afterward would shove both nations toward a decision neither side truly wanted. To understand the moment about to unfold, you need to understand what put these forces on a collision course in the first place. 48 hours earlier, the United States had carried out its first airstrike in Latin America since Panama, 1989. The target, a small speedboat in the southern Caribbean, allegedly carrying narcotics and operated by members of Tren de Aragua, a Venezuelan gang the Trump administration had labeled a foreign criminal organization. The strike was immediate, precise, and total. The boat ceased to exist, and all 11 aboard were killed. President Trump announced the operation on September 2nd, posting the strike video to Truth Social and labeling the dead as drug traffickers. He promised more missions were coming. Secretary of State Marco Rubio sharpened that message even further. At a press conference in Mexico City the following day, he made the administration's view unmistakable. Interdiction doesn't work because these drug cartels, what they do is they know they're going to lose, 2% of their cargo. They bake it into their economics. What will stop them is when you blow them up, when you get rid of them. For decades, counter-narcotics operations in the Caribbean meant interdictions. Coast Guard cutters pulling alongside sketchy vessels. Boarding teams, arrests, legal proceedings. This was something entirely different. In Caracas, the backlash was instant and enraged. President Nicolas Maduro condemned the strike as an act of imperial aggression, carried out without evidence or due process. The Venezuelan Foreign Ministry accused Washington of killing 11 people without trial, warning, or justification. And somewhere deep inside the Venezuelan military hierarchy, a decision formed. If the Americans were going to operate this close to Venezuelan waters, they would receive a reminder of whose backyard they were in. The USS Jason Dunham hadn't been meant for the Caribbean. Only weeks earlier, the Arleigh Burke-class destroyer had been conducting routine operations far from Latin America. But in August, new orders arrived from the Pentagon, new tasking, new theater. Report to U.S. Southern Command immediately. The Dunham became one of 3 destroyers rushed south as part of the Trump administration's counter-narcotic surge. The USS Gravely arrived first, then the USS Sampson. Combined with the amphibious assault ship USS Iwo Jima and her Marine Expeditionary Unit, they formed the largest American naval presence in Latin America in more than 30 years. Armed with Tomahawks, a 5-inch gun, and the Aegis combat system capable of tracking over 100 targets at once, the Dunham was built for overwhelming control of any battle space. But Venezuela had one card left, 3 of them, technically. Old, battered, but still lethal F-16s. Ironically, American F-16s. Venezuela had purchased 24 of them in 1982 through the Peace Delta program. Delivered between 1983 and 1985, they were the crown jewels of Latin American air power. But decades of sanctions had slowly suffocated the fleet. No spare parts, no proper maintenance. Of the original 24, only 3 remained flight-worthy. 3 was enough to send a message. And now those same jets, designed in American factories, sold in a different political era, were about to be used against the Navy that built them. At 6:49 a.m., the Dunham's Combat Information Center hummed with quiet, tense precision. Blue light washed across the faces of sailors locked onto their consoles as the two radar returns sharpened. Speed, 480 knots. Altitude dropping. The jets had come below 3,000 feet. The captain stepped closer to the tactical display, watching two green triangles cut across the digital sea toward the blue square representing his ship. When he asked for their closest point of approach, the operations specialist punched in the numbers, then delivered the answer. Less than 1 nautical mile. They would roar directly overhead. The captain didn't blink. He'd seen provocations, Russian bombers near Alaska, Iranian fast boats in the Strait of Hormuz. But this was different. This was the Caribbean. This was happening in America's backyard. And after the strike 2 days earlier, everyone on that bridge understood the stakes had shifted. He ordered Condition 3. Man all combat stations, weapons tight. The call rippled through the ship, and sailors moved with practiced discipline. No panic, no wasted motion. Just the steady rhythm of a crew built for moments like this. By 6:52, the Venezuelan jets had crossed into the Dunham's outer defense envelope, 25 miles out. At their current speed, they'd be overhead in under 3 minutes. In the electronic warfare suite, a petty officer leaned in as a new emission hit his screen. X-band radar, unmistakably the APG-66, the F-16's fire control radar, the very system used to lock targets before launching missiles. But it wasn't locked on. Not yet. The captain remained calm. He ordered continued tracking but no illumination. Activating the ship's own fire control radar would be the first step toward combat, and the exact provocation Venezuela was trying to trigger, a spark they could twist into global outrage. The Dunham would not oblige. At 6:54, the jets finally became visible through the bridge windows, two dark shapes against the pale morning sky, growing fast. On the flight deck below, sailors paused mid-task, their eyes drawn upward as the faint whine of engines rose into a sharp, approaching scream. The jets were close enough now for the details to sharpen. Swept back wings, a single tail fin, and the red, yellow, and blue roundels of the Venezuelan Air Force stamped on each fuselage. And they were armed. The lead aircraft carried a centerline fuel tank, but the wing pylons weren't empty. Even from this distance, the slender shapes of air-to-air missiles were undeniable Sidewinder variants, heat-seeking, short-range killers. The captain registered the sight with no visible reaction. Sidewinders couldn't sink a destroyer. They weren't meant to, but at this range, from this angle, the point was clear. Venezuela was baring its teeth. At 6:55, the jets began their attack run. The lead F-16 lowered its nose, dropping to barely 1,500 feet. The wingmen held tight in formation. On the Dunham's bridge, no one spoke. The only sound was the deepening roar of turbofans cutting through Caribbean air. Aft of the ship, the phalanx close-in weapon system swiveled automatically, its white dome locked on the approaching aircraft. Its radar had already solved the math, calculating firing angles with cold precision. In a real engagement, its 20mm Gatling gun would spit 4,500 rounds a minute into the sky. But safeties remained on. Weapons type meant exactly that. No one fires first. 2 aircraft and a billion-dollar warship, separated by 600 feet of humid morning air. Then, just like that, the jets were gone. Sharply climbing, banking hard, and angling back toward the Venezuelan coast. The thunder receded, but the captain wasn't easing off. Experience had taught him that a first pass was rarely the last. And this time, he was right. At 7:02, the radar picture shifted. The contacts were returning, but now the approach had changed. Instead of flying together, the F-16 split. One angled toward the bow while the other widened its loop to swing in behind the Dunham's stern. A textbook pincer. A maneuver designed to split a ship's focus, to force a defensive dilemma. The captain tuned the radio to Channel 16, the Universal Maritime Hailing Frequency, and keyed the mic. Venezuelan military aircraft, this is a United States Navy warship operating in international waters. You are conducting unsafe maneuvers in close proximity to a naval vessel. Maintain a safe distance and identify your intentions. Static, then silence. The jets pressed on. At 7:04, the lead F-16 dropped even lower, 800 feet now, vanishing below the horizon line before tearing toward the destroyer like a guided missile. In the electronic warfare suite, alarms erupted. The second jet, the one that had looped behind, had activated its fire control radar. For 3 seconds, the Dunham was bathed in enough electromagnetic energy to guide a missile straight into her hull. Aegis reacted instantly. Jamming frequencies spiked on. Decoy launchers armed themselves. The SPY-1D radar shifted into enhanced tracking, painting both fighters with the precision needed to feed targeting data to every weapon system aboard. But still, no shots fired. Weapons tight remained the law. Then, abruptly, the radar lock disappeared. The second F-16 climbed, sliding back into formation behind its wingman as the pair veered toward the Venezuelan coastline. By 7:06, the radar screens were empty again, and the Caribbean settled back into uneasy quiet. In the CIC, someone finally exhaled. A small sound, carrying the weight of everything that hadn't happened. For the next hour, the Dunham held her course. Same heading, same speed, as if the last 12 minutes hadn't nearly sparked an international crisis. But in the Combat Direction Center, the moment was being dissected in forensic detail. Radar logs, electronic emissions, camera feeds, everything captured, time-stamped, encrypted, and transmitted to Norfolk. By mid-morning, the footage was sitting in the Pentagon. Analysts replayed each second, frame by frame, and the conclusion was unanimous. This was a deliberate show of force, not an attack, a message. Venezuela wanted Washington to understand that U.S. warships operating off its shores would not go unchallenged. The Pentagon's statement that afternoon called the flyby a highly provocative maneuver designed to interfere with counter-narcotics operations. In Caracas, the narrative flipped. Venezuelan state television aired cockpit footage showing the Dunham from above, a gray pinprick on endless blue water. The anchor declared it a heroic defense of Bolivarian sovereignty. Same ocean, same encounter, 2 nations, 2 stories. But here's what neither version showed. In the hours after the flyover, the Pentagon had already acted. 10 F-35B stealth fighters from Marine Fighter Attack Squadron 225 were ordered to Puerto Rico. The first aircraft touched down at the former Roosevelt Roads Naval Station on September 13th, unit markings stripped off for operational security. Additional destroyers shifted closer to the Venezuelan coastline. And somewhere beneath the Caribbean, American attack submarines quietly altered their patrol lanes. The jets had made their point, but the U.S. Navy's answer was already unfolding. The situation didn't cool down. It escalated. 2 days after the first flyover, Venezuelan jets returned. Same tactics, same message, same deliberate provocation. Pentagon officials later described the encounter as a game of chicken. Then came September 12th. The Dunham conducted an 8-hour boarding of a Venezuelan fishing vessel named Carmen Rosa. Caracas called it an illegal act of aggression. Washington said it was a narcotics search. They found nothing. Meanwhile, Venezuela mobilized more than 200,000 troops. State television showcased tanks rumbling down highways, artillery rolling toward coastal outposts, and militia units drilling on beaches. And then, in late October, the Pentagon revealed its biggest move. The USS Gerald R. Ford, the world's largest and most advanced aircraft carrier, was ordered south. She arrived in the Caribbean on November 16th with over 70 aircraft and enough firepower to overwhelm the military of most nations. With her arrival, the largest U.S. naval deployment to Latin America since the Cold War was complete. What happened that morning on September 4th wasn't a battle. No shots fired. No casualties. On paper, it barely qualifies as an incident. But talk to anyone who stood on that bridge, or anyone watching live feeds in Washington or Caracas, and they'll tell you it meant far more than the official reports suggest. This was gray zone warfare, the space between peace and open conflict. You don't start a war. You get close enough to make the other side wonder, if you will. You flex. You test resolve. You measure reactions. Venezuela's F-16s were never going to attack that destroyer. The pilots knew it. The Americans knew it. But in those few seconds when the jets screamed overhead and fire control radar washed across the Dunham's hull, both sides were reminded of a simple, brutal truth. The distance between provocation and catastrophe is measured in seconds. One nervous pilot, one misread radar return, one twitch of a trigger finger, and the entire world changes. But the Dunham's crew held their discipline. They didn't take the bait. They didn't escalate. They documented everything and stayed on mission, showing a kind of strength you can't learn in any classroom. Restraint under pressure is its own kind of power. Venezuela showed it could fly fighters over an American warship. The United States showed it wouldn't be dragged into a fight it didn't choose. Both sides claimed victory. Neither side blinked. And the Caribbean, that stretch of contested water between two clashing visions of the world, remained exactly what it's always been. Tense, complicated, and one mistake away from chaos. So let me ask you this. If you were standing on that bridge, watching two fighter jets diving toward your ship with their targeting radar painting your hull, what would you do? Would you hold your fire or light them up? Drop your answer in the comments. I read every single one. If you enjoyed this breakdown, hit that like button and subscribe so you don't miss what's coming next. And if you want to support the channel directly, consider joining the fleet. You'll get loyalty badges, priority replies, and you'll help us bring more true maritime stories to the surface. Just head to the channel page and click join, because out here, the difference between a close call and a global headline is usually about 600 feet of airspace and a whole lot of discipline. I'll see you in the next one.